Yeah, so the police are like the violent spear of a much broader system, or sort of the visible spear. And of course, police as the guardians of law and order, an armed group of people intent on preserving law and order are going to preserve the order as it is defined.
Exactly.
I did a bit of reading of your stuff in preparation for this interview, and you write in a piece you wrote for AAIHS that attending to structures of abandonment is critical to understand and eradicate mass incarceration. I really like that idea of structures of abandonment. But I'm wondering if you could sort of zoom out a little bit and talk about the broader relationship between capital and prisons, economic restructuring in prisons. I mean, our country after World War II underwent a great sort of industrial transformation. How is that story connected to the rise of our prisons, the proliferation of our prisons?
Yeah, and I think this is where we think Gilmore's work has been so influential on me personally, but also just really transformative, right? And she uses this phrase, although I think she might get it from David Harvey, of organized abandonment, right? That certain areas, certain neighborhoods have been sort of structurally divested from, right? And that was a plan. That was a series of policies, right, to lead to that point. And I know I'm just spewing citations here, but Miriam Kaba, who's an abolitionist organizer and theorist, talks about people freak out about people in media freak out about defund the police, but people in communities have seen defunding happen all the time, right? They've seen their kids' school get defunded. They've seen the public transportation system get defunded. And so it's not a shock to say defund the police for lots of people who have experienced other forms of removal of resources, right? A denial of capital. And so I think, just to get back to your question about how does this disinvestment give us the proliferation of prisons? There are a large series of political economic transformations in beginning after 1968 that see a lot of corporations be much more nimble and move regions, but also move nations, so that productive capacity, in typical industrial productive capacity, declines in many cities around and regions around the country. While at the same time, and this is where I think Gilmore's analysis is so astute, change in finance capital, so wealthy people's ability to invest, and land use, right? That all of these things are in flux, and the people who are most affected by those changes in land and finance and the kind of power and purpose of the state are those who are already the most marginalized to begin with, right? So you have, in the decades after World War II, the US is as close to full employment as it's perhaps ever been, and yet that system takes place in a highly segregated labor market. And so you have a lot of Black and brown working class men in the prime years of their working lives who are unable to get jobs, right? Or the jobs that they're able to get are the lowest paid, most menial, no possibility for advancement, dealing with lots of racist harassment, right? Unable to join the union. I mean, across the board, when you look at construction, you look at manufacturing, you see in this time period just immense segregation. And so this is, where a kind of anti-racist call for full employment, or for genuine full employment, anchors a lot of Black radicalism from the more kind of liberal social democratic end to all the way to the radical end, right? So you have Bayard Rustin and Huey Newton are both talking about full employment, right? With some different inflections, but certainly a shared analysis. That's a big part of what augurs the protests and the urban rebellions in the mid-60s.
Right.
And of course those kinds of jobs were more plentiful at that time, right? What happens after the 60s, when you have the transformation to a more high economy and the decline of some industrial base, is that certain neighborhoods, which include a lot of what had already been segregated inner city neighborhoods, become divested of all forms of capital. And these become the neighborhoods that are most heavily targeted for policing and for punishment. And so simply, there's a lot of work in sociology and criminology, like simply being in those neighborhoods becomes cause for suspicion, right? So the war on crime begets the war on drugs, which begets the war on gangs, which has a lot of guilt by association type policies, right? So, you know, this gets back to something I was saying earlier about the fungibility of crime, that if you have a gun, you might not encounter police at all. But if you have a gun in a certain neighborhood, you may encounter the police, you might get a higher sentence because you were in that neighborhood, or you were standing next to somebody who has a police record. Right? The act of owning a gun or having a gun is not any more or less legal in that neighborhood than a more posh neighborhood. But all of a sudden you're facing a stiffer prison sentence because of it.
Yeah, I think it's, you know, it's interesting. I think it's important to think about it historically, right? Because in terms of abandonment, or in terms of problem solving, right? Because you mentioned, you know, like the Black Panthers and Bayard Rustin are talking about the same thing in the 60s. You know, the Kerner Commission, right, like concludes out of the urban rebellions, there is a crisis in the United States. These problems, you know, we're moving towards two societies, separate and unequal. Like there's a crisis. We need to act now. And the response of the state was not to actually address those issues, but instead police and prisons. And so I think, you know, one way of looking at this is that this is a way of solving a problem rather than making other choices about how to maybe address social problems.
That's exactly right, and much better said than what I said. Right, I think it is exact. I mean, I often say like that prisons are a problem masquerading as a solution. Right, they present themselves as, well, this is a response to crime, right? This is a response to wrongdoing. And of course, we know that that's not true, right? For all the reasons that the US has had the world's biggest prison population for more than 2 decades, and yet we still have crime, right? We still have people being harmed in ways that are not, that there's no accountability for. And our sense of inequality has only, or experience of inequality has only deepened, right? But this idea that you know, we hold on to prison precisely because they are the alternative to the kind of system or society that provides for people's needs. Right? If you're going to have this much inequality, you're going to need an apparatus to deal with the fact that people don't like it, right? That people would much rather have jobs and healthcare and ability to provide for themselves and their loved ones. And prevented that opportunity, you get the kind of system we live with now.